The wind did not just blow, it screamed, carrying microscopic shards of ice that sliced exposed skin like shattered glass. At 35 degrees below zero, human breath freezes on the eyelashes, binding them shut, and the fluid in your joints turns to sludge. Abigail pulled the heavy nylon rope until the coarse fibers chewed through her wool mittens, leaving her palms slick with blood that instantly crystallized. Behind her, bundled in a child's plastic hunting sled, her 68-year-old mother, Margaret, had stopped shivering a terrifying medical reality, signaling the final stages of hypothermia. Abigail had nothing left but the raw, unadulterated fury of a widow betrayed. They had been thrown out to die in the white void, but Abigail made a silent, violent vow to the screaming sky. The snow would not become their grave. The bitter end did not begin with the storm, but with the sharp, authoritative rapping of knuckles against the heavy oak door of the cabin. It was a sound that shattered the quiet sanctuary Abigail Preston had desperately tried to maintain since her husband, Thomas, had been crushed by a falling Douglas fir 6 months prior. Outside the frosted panes of the cabin, nestled deep in the unforgiving backcountry of the Bitterroot Mountains in Montana, the sky was a bruised, terrifying purple. The radio on the kitchen counter had been broadcasting emergency polar vortex warnings for 2 days. Do not travel. Do not go outside. Exposed flesh will freeze in under 5 minutes. Abigail wiped her flour-dusted hands on her apron. She was baking bread, trying to fill the drafty cabin with a scent of warmth for her mother, Margaret, who sat near the cast-iron wood stove. Margaret's hands were permanently curled into stiff claws from severe rheumatoid arthritis, her mind occasionally unmooring itself from the present due to early-stage dementia. The knock came again, louder, rattling the hinges. Abigail pulled the deadbolt back. Standing on the snow-swept porch was Richard Sterling, Thomas's estranged older brother. Beside him stood Deputy Miller, a young, nervous-looking officer from the county sheriff's department whose breath plumed rapidly in the frigid air. Richard wore a heavy, fleece-lined Carhartt coat, his face set in a rigid mask of greedy impatience. "Richard, what are you doing here?" Abigail asked, stepping into the doorway to block the biting wind. "I'm here for the property, Abby," Richard said, his voice flat, devoid of any familial warmth. He didn't look at her face. He looked past her, assessing the interior of the cabin. "I told you 3 weeks ago the grace period was up. Thomas put this cabin up as collateral for the business loan I gave him. He defaulted by dying. The deed reverted to me on the 1st of the month." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. "Richard, the roads are closed. The governor declared a state of emergency. It is 30 degrees below zero outside and dropping. You can't be serious." "Law is the law," Richard replied, stepping forward and forcing Abigail to step back into the entryway. He unzipped his coat, pulling out a sheaf of legal documents bearing the cold embossed seal of the county court. "I have a buyer in Seattle who wants the land cleared and the title transferred by Monday. If I don't take possession today, I lose the sale." Abigail turned her eyes to Deputy Miller, desperate for a shred of humanity. "Deputy, look at my mother. She's in a wheelchair. If we leave now, we will die. It's a 30-mile drive to the nearest town, and the plows haven't run since yesterday." Deputy Miller looked down at his heavy boots, snow melting off the treads onto Abigail's braided rug. "Ma'am, I just execute the orders. Mr. Sterling has the court order for immediate vacancy. If you don't leave, I have to remove you for trespassing." "I'm truly sorry, Mrs. Preston. I really am. Sorry won't keep my mother's heart beating." Abigail's voice broke, echoing off the timber walls. She turned back to Richard. "Give me until tomorrow. Let the storm break. We'll leave the keys on the counter. Please, Richard." For Thomas, the mention of his brother's name did not soften Richard. It seemed to harden him further. A bitter rivalry had always existed between the brothers, and in Thomas's death, Richard had found his ultimate, twisted victory. "You have 30 minutes to pack what you can carry," Richard said, checking his heavy steel wristwatch. "Anything left behind is considered abandoned property." Panic, pure and suffocating, seized Abigail's chest. She looked at Margaret, who was smiling vacantly at the fire, oblivious to the death sentence being handed down in the foyer. 30 minutes, Abigail whispered, the reality crashing down on her. She moved like a woman possessed. She dragged a large canvas duffel bag from the hall closet and began hurling survival items into it with frantic precision. She bypassed the photo albums, the family heirlooms, the delicate china her grandmother had left her. Survival was the only metric now. Heavy wool blankets, Thomas's hunting knife, a waterproof box of Strike Anywhere matches, 2 thermoses filled to the brim with boiling water and Earl Grey tea, calorie-dense protein bars she had bought for Thomas's hiking trips. "Abby, dear, is it time for church?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling slightly as she noticed the frenetic energy in the room. "No, Mom. We're going on a trip," Abigail lied, her voice cracking as she forced thick thermal leggings over her mother's frail legs, followed by 3 layers of wool sweaters. She wrapped Margaret's head in a thick scarf, leaving only her eyes exposed. "Time's up," Richard barked from the doorway. He had already opened the front door wide, letting the sub-zero wind howl into the cabin, instantly sucking the heat from the room. The fire in the stove sputtered and hissed. Abigail grabbed the handles of her mother's wheelchair. She hoisted the heavy canvas bag over her shoulder, the strap digging painfully into her collarbone. She pushed Margaret out onto the porch. The cold hit them like a physical wall, a shocking, breath-stealing impact that felt as though all the oxygen had been vacuumed from the atmosphere. As Abigail wrestled the wheelchair down the ramp Thomas had built just a year ago, she heard the heavy metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place behind them. They were locked out. The cabin, their only shelter, was gone. The snow in the driveway was nearly 3 feet deep, an impassable ocean of white. Abigail's 1998 Subaru Outback sat at the end of the drive, resembling a frozen, white mound. She pushed Margaret through the snow, using her own body as a snowplow, her heavy boots sinking to her thighs with every agonizing step. She reached the car, her chest heaving, the freezing air burning her lungs like inhaled bleach. She yanked the driver's side door open, ignoring the painful tearing sensation as the frozen rubber weather stripping ripped away. She climbed in, her hands shaking violently, and thrust the key into the ignition. She turned it. Click. Nothing. Not even the sluggish groaning of a dying starter. Total silence. Abigail jumped out and popped the hood, sweeping the snow off the windshield to see. She stared at the engine block. The battery cables had been cleanly severed. A fresh, bright cut gleamed in the dim light of the storm. Richard hadn't just evicted them. He had guaranteed their isolation. He knew she would try to take the car. He had effectively signed their death warrants. "Abby, it's awfully cold in this car," Margaret murmured from the wheelchair outside, her teeth beginning to chatter audibly. Abigail slammed the hood down. She could not afford the luxury of tears. Tears froze. Tears caused frostbite on the cheeks. She had to think. The nearest shelter was the old Forestry Ranger Station, an abandoned cinder-block building located roughly 3 miles up the old logging road. 3 miles. In deep snow. At -35 degrees. She couldn't push the wheelchair. The small wheels were already hopelessly bogged down in the snowdrifts. She ran to the dilapidated woodshed on the edge of the property, her eyes scanning the shadows. There, leaning against a cord of birchwood, was an orange, heavy-duty plastic sled Thomas had used for hauling deer carcasses out of the deep woods. She dragged the sled back to the car. "Mom, I need to move you," Abigail said, her voice muffled by her scarf. "Are we taking a sleigh ride?" Margaret asked, her mind retreating further into the comforting delusions of the past to escape the terrifying agony of the cold. "Yes, Mom. A sleigh ride." Abigail lifted her mother's fragile, bird-like body from the wheelchair. Margaret weighed perhaps 90 pounds, but wrapped in layers of wool and canvas, she felt as heavy as lead. Abigail placed her gently into the orange plastic sled, tucking the heavy wool blankets tightly around her sides, cocooning her. She used a length of climbing rope from the trunk of the dead Subaru to strap Margaret securely to the sled's molded handles so she wouldn't fall out. Abigail tied the other end of the rope around her own waist, fashioning a makeshift harness. She leaned forward, throwing her entire body weight against the rope. The sled groaned against the frozen crust of the snow, then slid forward. The death march began. The first mile was a masterclass in human suffering. The logging road was an open corridor, funneling the northern winds directly into their faces. The wind chill pushed the temperature to a lethal -50 degrees. Every step required Abigail to lift her leg high out of the snow, thrust it forward, and drag the weight of the sled behind her. The muscles in her thighs screamed, burning with lactic acid, while the skin on her face felt as though it were being repeatedly stung by wasps. She fell into a rhythmic, desperate mantra. Left foot, right foot, pull. Left foot, right foot, pull. The landscape around them was devoid of color, an endless, violent swirl of white and gray. The towering pine trees whipped back and forth, groaning under the weight of the ice, sounding like the snapping bones of giants. By the second hour, the physical toll began to manifest in terrifying ways. Abigail could no longer feel her toes. Her feet had become heavy wooden blocks, clunking against the ice beneath the snow. The rope tied around her waist had bruised her ribs, and the continuous friction was rubbing her hip bones raw. She stopped to check on Margaret. She brushed a thick layer of snow off the top blanket and peeled back the edge. Margaret's eyes were closed, her skin a terrifying shade of translucent blue, her lips tinged purple. "Mom, Mom, wake up," Abigail shouted, shaking her mother's shoulder. Margaret's eyelids fluttered open, but her pupils were dilated and unfocused. "Thomas?" she whispered. "Is Thomas back from the mill?" "No, Mom, it's Abby. You have to stay awake. Drink this." Abigail pulled the thermos from the duffel bag, struggling to unscrew the cap with her numb, uncooperative mittens. She poured a small amount of steaming tea into the cup and pressed it to Margaret's rigid lips. Most of it spilled down the old woman's chin, instantly freezing into a brown icicle, but a few drops made it past her teeth. "Keep going," Abigail told herself, turning back to the wind. Just one more mile. But the storm had other plans. A deafening crack echoed over the howling wind. Abigail looked up just in time to see a massive, 80-foot dead standing pine tree, heavily laden with snow, snap at its base. It fell with the force of an earthquake directly across the logging road, blocking their path completely. Abigail stared at the massive wall of shattered timber and jagged branches. The road was impassable. To go around it meant venturing off the relatively flat grade of the road and into the steep, treacherous, unmapped ravines of the forest. There was no choice. Abigail altered their course, veering left off the road and into the dense, old-growth timber. Here, the wind was slightly broken by the massive trunks of the trees, but the terrain was a nightmare. Beneath the deceptive, smooth surface of the snow lay hidden deadfalls, jagged boulders, and deep, invisible hollows. Within 20 minutes of leaving the road, disaster struck. Abigail stepped forward, expecting solid ground, but her boot plunged into a void. It was a snow bridge over a steep ravine. She pitched forward, tumbling down the embankment in a flurry of snow and limbs. The rope around her waist yanked violently, pulling the sled and her mother over the edge. Abigail scrambled, her gloved hands clawing frantically at the icy roots protruding from the slope, screaming as she watched the orange sled slide past her, careening toward the bottom of the gorge. The sled hit a snowbank at the bottom and flipped. Margaret was thrown violently, though the ropes kept her tethered to the heavy plastic shell. "Mom!" Abigail shrieked, sliding on her stomach the rest of the way down the embankment. She frantically dug through the snow, righting the sled and brushing the white powder from Margaret's face. Margaret was unconscious. Her pulse was so faint, Abigail had to press her bare fingers against her mother's icy neck to find it a weak, erratic flutter. Abigail looked around in despair. They were at the bottom of a steep, V-shaped limestone gorge. The walls rose 50 feet on either side. The light was failing rapidly as the short winter day gave way to the encroaching blackness of night. Surviving the night in the open at the bottom of this trench was impossible. The cold would seep into their organs and quietly extinguish their lives before midnight. She dragged the sled along the base of the cliff wall, searching for any natural depression, a fallen tree, anything to act as a windbreak. Then she saw it, hidden behind a curtain of thick, frozen ivy and the skeletal remains of a dead juniper bush. The limestone rock face pulled back into a dark, jagged fissure. It was a natural cave, an anomaly in the solid rock. The opening was barely 4 feet high and maybe 3 feet wide, a black throat swallowing the snow. Abigail didn't hesitate. She dragged the sled toward the opening. She had to crawl on her hands and knees to clear the snow and debris from the entrance. The smell inside was earthy, dry, and faintly metallic. It was pitch black, but more importantly, the air inside was completely still. The howling wind of the polar vortex became a muffled, distant roar the moment she crossed the threshold. It was still freezing, but without the devastating wind chill, the ambient temperature inside felt almost 20 degrees warmer. She crawled back out, untied the rope from her waist, and grabbed the sled's harness. Leaning backward on her elbows, she dragged the sled into the cave. The floor was surprisingly smooth, covered in decades of dry dust and loose shale. "We made it, Mom. We're inside," Abigail panted, though her mother did not respond. She unbuckled the straps and pulled Margaret out of the sled, laying her on top of the sleeping bags to insulate her from the freezing rock floor. Now came the most critical task: fire. Without a heat source, the stillness of the cave would only delay their deaths, not prevent them. Abigail's hands were practically useless. The fine motor skills had completely vanished. She felt as though she were wearing thick boxing gloves. She clumsily unzipped the duffel bag and pulled out the waterproof matchbox. She had no kindling, no wood. She looked around the dim cave entrance. She crawled outside, breaking off handfuls of the dead, dried juniper twigs that guarded the cave, and brought them back in. She piled the twigs on the flat rock. She dug into her pockets, pulling out lint, a crumpled grocery receipt, and finally ripped the title page out of Thomas's old leather-bound journal she carried for sentimental reasons. She pulled a match from the box. She tried to strike it against the rough strip, but her grip failed. The match snapped in half. She cursed, tears finally brimming in her eyes, stinging violently as they met the cold air. She took a deep, shuddering breath. Focus. She pinned a second match between the heels of her palms, pressing her hands together like she was praying. She scraped it down the box. A flare of sulphurous orange light erupted in the dark. She cupped it desperately, lowering the fragile flame to the pocket lint and paper. The paper caught, curling and browning before leaping into a small, fragile fire. She gently laid the smallest juniper twigs over the flame. They smoked, then caught. Heat, glorious, radiant heat, began to push back the encroaching darkness. Abigail fed the fire until it was a steady, crackling blaze, illuminating the walls of the cave. She moved her mother as close to the fire as safely possible, rubbing Margaret's icy hands, willing her own body heat into her mother's frail frame. As the fire grew brighter, its flickering light reached deeper into the cavern, chasing away the shadows. Abigail sat back on her heels, wiping sweat and melted snow from her brow, and looked deeper into their sanctuary. Her heart skipped a beat. The cave did not just end in a shallow wall of rock. It extended backward, sloping downward into the earth. And there, sitting perfectly square in the center of the cavern floor, about 20 feet back, illuminated by the dancing firelight, was a rusted heavy steel locker. Beside it sat a perfectly stacked cord of split firewood, unrotted and dry, untouched by the elements. She wasn't the first person to seek refuge here. Abigail picked up a burning branch to use as a torch and cautiously walked toward the back of the cave. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. No footprints marred the surface except her own. Whoever had left this had done so a very long time ago. She reached the steel locker. It was secured with a heavy brass padlock, but the shackle was so eaten by rust that when Abigail struck it with a heavy piece of firewood, it shattered. She threw the lid open. Inside were heavy wool blankets sealed in heavy plastic, a Coleman camp stove, 3 unrusted cans of white gas, military-grade rations, a first aid kit, and an old, heavy-caliber repeating rifle, wrapped in an oiled cloth. It was a survival cache, a lifeline dropped straight from heaven. Abigail let out a sob of pure, unadulterated relief. She turned back to look at her mother, who was finally beginning to shift and groan as the heat reached her bones. They were going to survive. They had fire, they had wood, and now they had supplies to wait out the storm. But as Abigail stepped away from the locker, her boot caught on something protruding from the dirt. She lowered her torch. It was a heavy leather boot, attached to a skeletal leg bone, protruding from a massive pile of collapsed rock at the very rear of the cave. A low, terrifying rumble suddenly vibrated through the soles of her boots. It wasn't thunder. It was the mountain itself. The heavy snowfall and the violent wind had overloaded the steep slope above the gorge. Abigail spun around toward the cave entrance. "Mom!" A deafening roar consumed the world. A massive wall of white snow, ice, and uprooted trees cascaded over the lip of the gorge, crashing down with the force of a freight train. The avalanche slammed into the mouth of the cave, instantly snuffing out the daylight and packing the narrow entrance with 10 feet of concrete hard, compacted snow. The roar faded into absolute, terrifying silence. The small fire flickered, casting long, frantic shadows against the walls. Abigail, dropped her torch. They had survived the eviction. They had survived the cold. But as she stared at the solid wall of snow, sealing them inside the earth with the remains of whoever had died here before them, she realized the true battle for survival had only just begun. The silence that followed the avalanche was not peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The immense weight of thousands of tons of compacted snow and shattered timber had effectively corked the only exit, trapping them in a lightless limestone tomb. Abigail knelt in the dirt, her chest heaving as adrenaline surged and crashed in her bloodstream. The small fire she had built from juniper twigs and Thomas's journal was still burning, casting a frantic, dancing orange glow against the walls. But as she watched, the flames began to behave strangely. Instead of leaping upward, the fire flattened, smoking heavily, the orange turning to a sickly, starved blue. A sharp, metallic taste coated the back of Abigail's throat. Her head began to throb with a dull, rhythmic ache directly behind her eyes. "The oxygen," she gasped aloud, her voice sounding deadened in the enclosed space. The fire was eating the limited oxygen in the sealed cave, replacing it with lethal carbon monoxide. The very thing keeping them from freezing to death was now actively poisoning them. She had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the invisible gas put them both to sleep forever. She lunged toward the fire. She didn't have water to spare, and throwing snow from the avalanche wall would create steam that could scald her in the tight space. Using her thick, snow-caked leather boots, she furiously stomped the flames, kicking dirt and loose shale over the embers, until the cave plunged into absolute, terrifying darkness. The abrupt absence of light was a physical blow. Abigail sat in the pitch black, listening to the agonizingly shallow, rattling breaths of her mother. Margaret had not moved since being placed on the sleeping bag. "Mom, can you hear me?" Abigail whispered into the void. "The choir." "Sounds lovely, Thomas," Margaret murmured, her voice weak and disjointed. The dementia and the hypothermia were intertwining, pulling her further from reality. Abigail had to find a way to vent the cave. She crawled backward on her hands and knees until her boots bumped against the heavy steel locker she had found earlier. She ran her hands over its cold surface, her fingers blindly searching through the contents she had briefly seen in the firelight. She bypassed the heavy wool blankets and the Coleman camp stove. Her hands closed around a hard, cylindrical object, a heavy-duty rubber flashlight. She pushed the stiff button on the end. A beam of brilliant, unearthly white light sliced through the darkness. It was a modern LED tactical flashlight, completely out of place, with the rusted locker and the skeletal remains. Someone had been here much more recently than the skeleton suggested. Abigail swept the beam across the cave. The avalanche had packed the entrance with a solid wall of ice and snow, pressing into the cavern like a white, frozen fist. She moved the light to the back of the cave, illuminating the macabre pile of rocks and the protruding skeletal leg, wearing a rotting leather logging boot. She approached the remains cautiously, the beam trembling in her hand. The rocks that had crushed this person had fallen from the ceiling of the cave, likely decades ago. Pinned beneath a massive limestone slab was a skeletal hand, and just beyond its reach lay a tarnished brass tin. Abigail wedged Thomas's hunting knife under the lid of the tin and popped it open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a small leather-bound logbook and a Montana driver's license. The plastic was yellowed, the edges curled, but the typed text was still legible. Arthur William Sterling. Date of birth, the 14th of August, 1942. Abigail felt the blood drain from her face. Sterling. This was Richard and Thomas's uncle, the black sheep of the family who had vanished into the Bitterroot Mountains in the late 1980s. The family legend claimed Arthur had run off to Alaska after a bitter dispute over the family's vast timber and mining holdings. But he hadn't gone to Alaska. He had died right here, crushed by a cave-in, less than 3 miles from the cabin. But why was there a modern tactical flashlight in his rusted cache? Abigail shone the light back into the open steel locker. Tucked beneath the unrusted cans of white gas was a modern, heavy-duty avalanche shovel with a collapsible aluminum handle. The blade was scratched, bearing the remnants of fresh blue paint. A horrifying realization crystallized in Abigail's mind. Richard hadn't just evicted them to sell the land. Richard knew about this cave. He had been here recently. He was using it to store modern gear alongside his dead uncle's old cache. She grabbed the aluminum shovel, extending the handle with a sharp click. If Richard had been here, he knew the terrain. He knew the avalanche paths. He had sent them down the logging road in a historic storm, knowing the dead pines would block the road, funneling them directly toward the gorge where the snowpack was lethally unstable. It wasn't an eviction. It was a calculated execution. For 48 hours, the cave was a tomb of agonizing repetition. Abigail lost all concept of day and night. The only markers of time were the ticking of her frozen wristwatch and the rhythmic, terrifying deterioration of her mother's breathing. The temperature inside the sealed cave hovered around a stagnant 15 degrees Fahrenheit. It was cold enough to freeze their exhaled breath onto the rock ceiling, creating a glittering canopy of frost above them, but warm enough to prevent immediate death. Abigail worked in total darkness to conserve the flashlight's batteries. She sat by the solid wall of avalanche debris, driving the aluminum shovel into the compacted snow. It was like trying to dig through set concrete. She chipped away chunks of ice, dragging the debris to the back of the cave to keep her workspace clear. Every hour, she managed to carve out perhaps 6 inches of a narrow tunnel upward, angling toward where she hoped the surface lay. Abigail dropped the shovel, the sharp clatter echoing loudly. She scrambled back to the sleeping bags, switching on the flashlight for a brief second. Margaret's face was sunken, her skin an ashen gray. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. "I'm so thirsty, sweetheart. Is the well frozen? I have water, Mom. Hold on." Abigail had been using the Coleman stove in brief, terrifying increments. She would ignite the white gas for exactly 3 minutes, just long enough to melt a pot of snow, then furiously extinguish it before the carbon monoxide could build to lethal levels in the unventilated space. She unscrewed the cap of her thermos and supported her mother's head, letting the lukewarm water trickle past Margaret's dry lips. Margaret swallowed weakly, coughing a harsh, wet sound that rattled deep in her chest. Pneumonia. The silent killer of the elderly in the cold. Without antibiotics, Margaret's lungs were slowly filling with fluid. "You're a good girl, Abby," Margaret whispered, her eyes closing again. "Thomas is. He's fixing the roof. I can hear his hammer." Abigail bit her lip so hard she tasted copper. The sounds Margaret was hearing weren't a hallucination of Thomas's hammer. They were the terrifying deep bass groans of the avalanche debris settling and shifting outside. The sheer weight of the snow above them was immense, and the structural integrity of their ice plug was unknown. Abigail retreated to the back of the cave, sitting beside the skeletal remains of Arthur Sterling. She turned the flashlight onto its lowest setting and opened Arthur's oilcloth-wrapped logbook. The entries were written in frantic, sprawling cursive. As Abigail read, the true, sickening depth of the Sterling family's greed unfurled before her. The 12th of October 1988, the final entry read, "My brother wants the valley. He thinks the timber is the prize. He's a fool. I found the old silver veins in the lower ridge. The assay reports confirm it. Millions in the rock. But he holds the surface deed. I hid the mineral rights addendum, the grandfather clause paper, in the false bottom of the locker. If he finds me, he kills me. The mountain is safer than my own blood." Abigail dropped the book. She scrambled to the steel locker and dragged out the remaining supplies. She ran her frozen fingers along the interior bottom panel. There was a slight ridge. She wedged her knife into the seam and pried upward. The sheet metal popped loose. Beneath it lay a sealed, heavy plastic document sleeve containing a pristine, notarized legal document from 1922. It was the absolute mineral rights deed to the entire Bitterroot Valley Basin, completely severing the subsurface wealth from the surface property. Richard didn't have a buyer in Seattle for a logging operation. He had a buyer for a massive silver mining operation. But without this specific piece of paper, any mining claim would be tied up in litigation for decades. Richard must have recently discovered Arthur's skeleton in the locker, but hadn't found the false bottom. He needed the cabin cleared, the land secured, and all loose ends, namely, Thomas's widow, erased so he could tear the mountain apart looking for this document. A sudden, violent tremor shook the cave. Dust and small rocks rained down from the ceiling. Abigail threw her arms over her head as a deafening crack echoed through the chamber. The wall of snow blocking the entrance violently buckled inward. A massive chunk of ice, weighing at least 300 pounds, dislodged from the ceiling of her dug tunnel and smashed onto the cave floor, crushing the aluminum shovel into twisted scrap metal. Abigail scrambled backward, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The tunnel she had spent 48 hours digging had just collapsed. They were back to square one, but worse. The structural integrity of the snow wall was failing. The pressure from the millions of tons of snow above was pushing inward. The cave wasn't just a tomb anymore. It was becoming a trash compactor. 72 hours. The air was undeniably thinner now. Every breath required a conscious, labored effort, pulling heavily at the muscles in Abigail's chest. When she turned on the flashlight, the beam caught the thick, glittering haze of dust and their own crystallized breath hanging stagnant in the air. Margaret was entirely unresponsive. Her pulse was a thready, terrifyingly slow beat beneath her icy skin. The wet rattle in her chest had grown quieter, a grim sign that she no longer had the strength to clear the fluid from her lungs. Abigail sat on the floor, her hands raw, bleeding, and trembling uncontrollably. Without the shovel, she had tried digging with Thomas's hunting knife and her bare, gloved hands, but the avalanche debris had compacted into solid blue ice. She had barely made a dent before exhaustion and oxygen deprivation forced her to stop. She looked at the rusted Winchester Model 70 rifle leaning against the cave wall. She had checked the action earlier. It was stiff but functional, chambered in, 30-06 Springfield. There was a half-empty cardboard box of heavy grain hunting ammunition in the locker. Arthur Sterling had brought it to defend himself against bears or his brother. Now it was Abigail's only tool. If she couldn't dig through the ice, she had to shatter it. The risk was astronomical. Firing a high-caliber rifle inside a sealed limestone cavern would produce a concussive shockwave that could rupture her eardrums. Worse, the kinetic impact against the ice wall could trigger a secondary collapse, bringing the entire mountain down on their heads and crushing them instantly. But staying meant suffocating in the dark within hours. "I'm sorry, Mom," Abigail whispered, grabbing the heavy wool blankets and piling them over Margaret's head and body to muffle the impending blast and protect her from shrapnel. Abigail picked up the Winchester. She loaded 3 heavy brass cartridges into the internal magazine and pushed the bolt forward, feeling the satisfying, mechanical clack as a round seated into the chamber. She walked toward the wall of blue ice. She didn't aim for the center, where the ice was thickest. She angled the barrel upward, aiming for the upper left corner of the blockage, right where the cave roof met the rock wall. If the snowpack was thinnest anywhere, it would be at the edges. She pressed her back firmly against the limestone wall of the cave, wrapping a thick scarf tightly around her ears and lower face. She raised the rifle, her muscles screaming in protest. She clicked the flashlight on and wedged it between 2 rocks to illuminate her target. She took a deep breath of the stale, freezing air. She let half of it out. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion inside the confined space was apocalyptic. A blinding flash of muzzle flare illuminated the cave and a terrifying stroke of lightning. The concussive blast hit Abigail like a physical punch to the chest, knocking the breath out of her and throwing her sideways against the dirt. A high-pitched, agonizing ringing instantly deafened her to all other sound. Chunks of jagged ice and pulverized rock rained down around her. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting for the ceiling to collapse. 10 seconds passed. The earth held. Abigail pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, shaking her head to clear the dizziness. Through the dust and cordite smoke hanging thickly in the beam of the flashlight, she looked at the ice wall. The heavy bullet had blown a crater in the ice, but it hadn't punched through. Tears of absolute frustration finally spilled over her frozen cheeks. She gritted her teeth, grabbed the rifle, and stood up. Her ears were bleeding slightly, warm trails running down her neck. She worked the bolt action. A smoking brass casing spun through the air and hit the dirt. She aimed at the exact center of the crater she had just created. She didn't bother wrapping her ears this time. She braced her stance. Bang! The recoil slammed into her bruised shoulder. More ice shattered, sending sharp shrapnel flying back into her face, cutting her cheek. She worked the bolt again. The final round. Bang! The third explosion felt as though it cracked her very skull. She dropped the rifle, falling to her knees, gasping for air in the smoke-filled darkness. She waited for the dust to settle. Slowly, painfully, she looked up. There, in the center of the deep, jagged crater carved by the 3 bullets, was a hole no larger than a tennis ball. And shining through that hole, cutting through the smoke and darkness like a divine spear, was a single brilliant beam of pure, unfiltered sunlight. Along with the light came a sound she hadn't heard in 3 days, the high, thin whistle of the wind. A rush of unimaginably cold, agonizingly fresh air pushed through the tiny hole, sweeping into the stagnant tomb. Abigail crawled toward the hole, pressing her bleeding face against the ice, and inhaled deeply. The freezing air burned her lungs, but it was the greatest thing she had ever tasted. It was life. She had breached the surface. They had oxygen. But as Abigail looked through the tiny fist-sized hole at the blinding white world outside, a new, terrifying reality dawned on her. The hole was 30 feet up, a sheer avalanche face. She had air, but she still had no way out. Her mother was dying, and Richard Sterling was out there, somewhere in that white wasteland, believing his problem was buried forever. The single beam of sunlight filtering through the bullet hole did not bring warmth. It brought a terrifying clarity to their desperate situation. It illuminated the dust motes, dancing in the stale air, and cast harsh, unforgiving shadows over Margaret's motionless body. The whistling wind from outside was a siren song promising oxygen, but carrying the lethal, ambient temperature of the Bitterroot Wilderness. Abigail knelt beside her mother. Margaret's breathing was no longer a wet rattle. It was a shallow, agonizingly slow wheeze, spaced so far apart that Abigail found herself holding her own breath in the intervals, waiting for the next rise of her mother's chest. The hypothermia had progressed into its final, silent stage. Margaret's core temperature had plummeted to the point where her body was shutting down non-essential organs to keep her heart and brain functioning. "Mom," Abigail whispered, pressing her lips against Margaret's icy, unfeeling forehead. "I have to leave you here for a little while. I have to go up. I'm going to bring help." Margaret did not respond. Her eyelids were translucent, showing the faint, sluggish movement of her eyes beneath. Abigail knew that carrying Margaret up a vertical, 30-foot chute of unstable avalanche debris was a physical impossibility. If she tried, they would both fall, and they would both die. Her only option was to breach the surface, find a way to signal for help, or reach the main highway 7 miles of treacherous, snow-blind wilderness away. She stood up, her muscles screaming in protest. The adrenaline from firing the rifle had burned off, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. She looked at the 30-foot wall of compacted snow and blue ice, separating them from the world. The 3 rifle rounds had created a rough, concave crater that tapered into the fist-sized hole at the top. It was, essentially, a chimney. Abigail gathered her tools. The aluminum avalanche shovel was destroyed, but the shaft had sheared off, leaving a jagged, 2-foot aluminum pipe. She gripped it in her left hand. In her right, she held Thomas's heavy, carbon steel hunting knife. She unloaded the heavy Winchester rifle, slung the thick leather strap tightly across her back, and shoved a handful of the heavy grain, 30-06 cartridges, into her coat pocket. She stepped into the base of the ice crater. The climb began. Abigail drove the hunting knife into the wall of compacted snow at shoulder height. It sank 3 inches before hitting solid ice. She tested her weight against it. It held. She swung the jagged aluminum pipe in her left hand, burying it into the ice above her head. Pull, step, kick. She drove the steel toe of her frozen logging boot into the ice wall, kicking a small foothold. She hauled her body weight upward. The muscles in her back and shoulders, already pushed to their absolute limits from dragging the sled, felt as though they were tearing from the bone. 10 feet up, the air in the chimney grew colder, rushing down from the surface hole and slicing through her sweaty thermal layers. Her hands were losing all sensation. The grip on the knife and the pipe relied entirely on the locked, desperate tension of her forearm. 15 feet. A chunk of ice the size of a cinder block broke loose beneath her right boot. Abigail plummeted downward. The sudden drop yanked violently on her arms. The hunting knife sliced downward through the snow, ripping a foot-long gash in the ice before it snagged on a dense, frozen root protruding from the debris. The aluminum pipe in her left hand popped out completely. She dangled by one arm, 15 feet above the rocky floor of the cave, her boots kicking frantically against the smooth, frictionless ice to find a purchase. A scream of pure agony tore from her throat as her shoulder joint threatened to dislocate under the sudden massive strain of her body weight and the heavy rifle strapped to her back. "Thomas," she sobbed, tears instantly freezing to her cheeks. She thought of her husband, of the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, of the gentle strength in his hands. He had built the cabin to protect them. He wouldn't let her die in the dark. With a guttural, primal roar, Abigail swung her left arm up, driving the jagged aluminum pipe back into the ice. It caught. She pulled herself up, slamming her knees into the frozen wall, kicking furiously until her boots found a narrow ledge of compacted snow. She hung there for 10 minutes, her forehead pressed against the freezing blue ice, her chest heaving, listening to the erratic, terrified hammering of her own heart. She could not afford another mistake. Inch by agonizing inch, she resumed the climb. 20 feet, 25 feet. The hole above her grew larger. She could see the deep, bruised twilight of the winter sky. The storm had broken. She reached the top of the chimney. The hole was too small for her shoulders to fit through. Hanging by the knife embedded in the ice, she used the aluminum pipe to furiously chip away at the edges of the opening. Sharp shards of ice rained down into her face, cutting her cheeks and forehead, blinding her. Finally, the hole was wide enough. Abigail jammed her arms through the opening, sinking her elbows deep into the soft, powdery surface snow. With one final, monumental exertion that tore the remaining strength from her core, she heaved her torso out of the hole. She rolled onto her back onto the surface of the snow, staring up at the sprawling, infinite canopy of the Milky Way galaxy. The air was perfectly still, and the temperature had to be pushing 40 below zero. She had made it out of the tomb. But as she sat up, wiping the freezing blood from her eyes, the sheer scale of the nightmare stretching before her became terrifyingly clear. The avalanche had completely erased the landscape. The gorge was filled level with snow. The towering pine trees were either snapped like toothpicks or buried entirely. And then, cutting through the absolute silence of the frozen wilderness, Abigail heard it. Ruh, reh, reh. It was a low mechanical whine, echoing off the distant ridges. It was the distinct sound of a high-powered two-stroke engine, a snowmobile. Abigail scrambled to her feet, sinking to her knees in the fresh powder. She looked toward the old logging road, roughly a mile away across the devastated landscape. A solitary, piercing beam of yellow halogen light was cutting through the dark timber, sweeping back and forth across the snow. Rescue? No. Search and rescue teams did not operate solitary snowmobiles in the dark, 30 miles in the backcountry, in post-blizzard conditions without a convoy. There was only one person who knew exactly where they were, and only one person who needed to confirm that the mountain had done its bloody work. Richard Sterling was hunting. Abigail dropped low, burying herself in a deep drift of snow behind the shattered trunk of a massive, uprooted Douglas fir. Her heart beat a frantic rhythm against her bruised ribs. She unslung the Winchester rifle from her back, her numb, trembling fingers fumbling in her coat pocket for the heavy brass cartridges. She pushed 2 rounds into the internal magazine and slammed the bolt forward. The metallic clack seemed deafening in the silent woods. The snowmobile was getting closer. The engine whined as it navigated the treacherous, uneven terrain of the avalanche path. The headlight beamed erratically, illuminating the jagged, alien landscape of broken timber and blue ice. As the machine crested a large snowdrift 50 yards away, Abigail got a clear view of the rider. It was Richard. He was clad in a top-of-the-line, heated snowmobile suit, his face obscured by a dark, reflective helmet visor. Strapped to the back of the snowmobile was a heavy-duty fiberglass sled, the kind used for hauling bodies out of the backcountry. But Richard wasn't looking for Abigail to save her. He stopped the snowmobile directly over what used to be the center of the gorge, less than 30 feet from the hole Abigail had just crawled out of. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was suffocating. Richard dismounted, pulling a long, collapsible avalanche probe pole from the side of the machine. He began systematically driving the 10-foot aluminum rod deep into the snowpack, stepping forward, driving it again. Thump, thump. He was looking for the cave. He was looking for Arthur's locker. Abigail watched him, a cold, calculated fury rising in her chest, burning hotter than the freezing air in her lungs. This man had signed her mother's death warrant. He had driven them out into a lethal storm, severed their vehicle's battery cables, and sent them into an avalanche zone, all for a piece of paper hidden in a rusted box. Richard drove the probe down again. It struck something hard with a sharp, metallic tink that resonated up the pole. "Got you," Richard muttered, his voice carrying clearly across the still, frigid air. He pulled the probe out and reached into the sled, pulling out a heavy, motorized ice auger. He didn't just want the deed. He was prepared to drill through the ice to get it, ensuring any survivors trapped inside would be buried under the resulting collapse. Abigail could not wait. If he drilled through the roof of the cave, the compromised structural integrity of the ice chimney would fail, crushing Margaret instantly. Abigail stepped out from behind the shattered fir tree. She raised the heavy Winchester rifle, settling the iron sight squarely on the center of Richard's chest. "Drop the auger, Richard." Abigail's voice rang out, sharp and steady, slicing through the freezing air like a whip. Richard froze. He slowly turned his head, the reflective visor of his helmet gleaming in the moonlight. He stared at the apparition standing 30 feet away, a woman covered in dirt, blood, and frost, holding a high-caliber rifle aimed directly at his heart. He slowly reached up and flipped his visor open. His face was pale, his eyes wide in genuine, unfiltered shock. "Abby, how the hell are you? Alive?" Abigail finished for him, her finger tightening slightly on the trigger. "No thanks to you. Step away from the machine. Now." Richard slowly lowered the heavy auger to the snow. He raised his hands to his shoulders, but his eyes darted calculatingly between Abigail, the rifle, and the hole in the snow a few yards away. The initial shock was fading, replaced by a dark, dangerous arrogance. "You don't want to do this, Abby," Richard said, his voice taking on a patronizing, reasonable tone. "You're freezing. You're not thinking straight. Put the gun down, and I'll take you back to town. We can get Margaret to a hospital." "Margaret is dying at the bottom of a 30-foot ice chute because of you," Abigail screamed, the raw emotion finally breaking through her stoic facade. "You knew the storm was coming. You knew the logging road was a dead end. You sent us out here to die so you could find Arthur's mineral rights deed." Richard's hands dropped an inch. His expression hardened into a terrifying, sociopathic calm. "So, you found the locker. You found the old man." "I found the false bottom," Abigail lied, needing him to believe she held all the cards. "I have the deed, Richard, the notarized document from 1922. The one that proves the Sterling surface property doesn't include the millions in silver beneath it. You evicting me didn't give you the mountain. It just gave you an empty cabin." Richard laughed, a dry, humorless sound that puffed into a cloud of white vapor. "You stupid, stubborn woman. You think a piece of paper matters out here? There is no law out here, Abby. There's just the cold, and the cold covers up everything." Before Abigail could react, Richard lunged toward the snowmobile. He wasn't reaching for the handlebars. He was reaching for a heavy, scoped hunting rifle strapped in a scabbard on the side of the machine. "Don't!" Abigail yelled, tracking him with the Winchester. Richard ripped the rifle from the scabbard and spun around, dropping to one knee to take aim. Abigail didn't hesitate. She didn't think about the morality of it. She thought of Thomas, crushed beneath the timber. She thought of Margaret, freezing in the dark. She squeezed the trigger. The Winchester roared, a tongue of orange flame erupting in the dark. The heavy, 30-06 round struck the engine block of the snowmobile, just inches from Richard's head. The cast-iron block shattered, sending jagged shrapnel flying outward. Richard screamed, dropping his rifle as he fell backward into the snow, clutching his leg. A piece of the engine casing had torn through his thick snowsuit, burying itself deep into his thigh. Dark, steaming blood immediately began to pool on the pristine white snow, stark and horrifying in the moonlight. Abigail kept her rifle raised, slowly advancing on him. The smell of gasoline and burning oil filled the air as the destroyed snowmobile hissed and sputtered. Richard groaned, writhing in the snow. His hands clamped desperately over his bleeding leg. You shot me," he gasped, the arrogance completely erased by the sudden, terrifying reality of his own mortality. "I missed," Abigail said coldly, standing over him, the barrel of the Winchester pointed down at his chest. "The next one won't." Richard looked up at her, his face contorted in pain and fear. The bleeding was severe. In the extreme cold, shock would set in within minutes. "Please, Abby, call it in. Use the radio on the sled. Call Miller. If I bleed out here, it's murder." "You came here to commit murder, Richard," Abigail said, her voice devoid of any pity. She looked down at the man who had tormented her, who had betrayed his own brother, who had tried to bury her alive. She reached into the storage compartment of the ruined snowmobile and pulled out the heavy, brick-like emergency satellite radio. She checked the battery indicator. It was fully charged. She keyed the microphone, tuning it to the county emergency frequency. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Abigail spoke into the cold plastic. This is Abigail Preston. I am at the old gorge off the North Logging Road. Avalanche site. I have a critical medical emergency. My mother is trapped beneath the ice, and Richard Sterling has suffered a severe arterial wound. Send life flight immediately. The radio crackled, and the frantic voice of the county dispatcher broke through the static. Copy that, Abigail Preston. We have your GPS coordinates from the radio ping. Life flight is scrambling from Missoula. ETA is 20 minutes. Stay on the line. Abigail clipped the radio to her coat. She looked down at Richard, whose skin was already taking on a waxy, grayish pallor as the blood loss and the extreme cold began to shut his body down. You're going to jail, Richard, Abigail said softly, watching the light slowly fade from his eyes. And I am going to tear this mountain apart. She turned her back on him and walked to the edge of the dark, gaping hole in the ice. She lay flat on her stomach, shining the flashlight down the terrifying 30-foot drop into the tomb. Mom? Abigail called out, her voice echoing down the chimney. Mom, hold on. The angels are coming. I promise you, the angels are coming. From deep within the earth, over the whistling wind and the groans of the dying man behind her, Abigail heard the faintest, weakest sound. It was a single, rattling breath. Margaret was still alive. The 20 minutes that followed the radio transmission were the longest of Abigail's life. Time ceased to be a measurement of seconds and minutes. It became a grueling tally of her mother's agonizingly slow, rattling breaths echoing up the ice chute, and the ragged, panicked wheezing of Richard bleeding out in the snow behind her. Abigail did not lower the Winchester. Even as the adrenaline fully evacuated her system, leaving her limbs trembling and her vision blurring at the edges, she maintained her vigil over the man who had orchestrated their doom. Richard's skin had turned a horrifying, translucent shade of gray. The steaming pool of dark blood had frozen into a slick, crimson sheet across the snow. He had stopped begging 10 minutes ago, his head lolling to the side, his consciousness slipping into the merciful void of hypovolemic shock. Thwack, 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 thwack. It started as a vibration in her frozen boots, a rhythmic thumping that seemed to beat in time with her own failing heart. Then, the sound breached the ridge, a heavy mechanical chopping that tore through the whistling wind. A twin-engine Sikorsky HH-60 Pavehawk helicopter, painted in the high-visibility orange and white of the Regional Search and Rescue Division, crested the tree line. Its massive dual searchlights cut through the bruised night sky, sweeping over the shattered timber before locking onto the wreckage of Richard's snowmobile. The downdraft from the massive rotors hit the clearing with hurricane force, whipping the loose powder into a blinding, stinging cyclone. Abigail shielded her face with her arm, finally lowering the rifle, and collapsed onto her knees. They had come. Figures clad in heavy, insulated tactical gear leaped from the side doors of the hovering chopper before the skids even touched the uneven, icy ground. The clearing erupted into a chaotic, highly choreographed symphony of salvation. "Over here!" Abigail screamed, though she could barely hear her own voice over the deafening roar of the turbines. She pointed a trembling, frostbitten finger toward the hole. "My mother! She's 30 feet down. She's dying." A medic with paramedic emblazoned in reflective lettering across his chest sprinted toward her, dropping a heavy trauma bag in the snow. Another team descended upon Richard, shouting medical shorthand, immediately applying a tactical tourniquet high on his ruined thigh and plunging thick IV needles into his veins to replace the massive volume of lost blood. "Ma'am, I need you to stay with me," the first medic shouted, shining a penlight into Abigail's dilated eyes. He took one look at her blackened, frost-bitten fingertips and the deep, bleeding lacerations on her face. "You're in severe hypothermia. Ignore me." Abigail grabbed the medic's heavy parka, her grip surprisingly ironclad. "Get Margaret. The ice is unstable. She's at the bottom." Two more rescue technicians rigged a heavy steel tripod over the breathing hole Abigail had blasted open. They worked with terrifying speed, securing climbing ropes and carabiners. A rescuer, no larger than Abigail, strapped into a harness. Lowering, the technician shouted, disappearing down the dark throat of the earth. For 3 agonizing minutes, there was only the sound of the helicopter engines. Then, the radio clipped to the lead technician's shoulder squawked. "I have the victim. She has a faint pulse, but she's bradycardic. Core temp is critically low. I'm securing her in the extraction litter. Haul away on my mark." Abigail wept. The tears froze instantly, stinging her battered cheeks, but she didn't care. As the winch whined and the bright orange extraction litter broke the surface of the hole, Abigail saw her mother's face. Margaret was terrifyingly pale, oxygen tubes already strapped beneath her nose, but her chest was rising and falling in a steady, artificially supported rhythm. "Load them up. We need to move," the flight surgeon barked. They bundled Abigail into the heated belly of the helicopter. As the machine lifted off the ground, banking sharply away from the mountain that had tried to claim them, Abigail looked down through the reinforced glass. The dark, jagged hole in the snow grew smaller and smaller, a tiny black scar on the face of the Bitterroot Wilderness, until it disappeared completely into the night. 2 weeks later, the beep of a heart monitor provided a stark contrast to the howling winds of the mountain. Abigail sat in a comfortable, vinyl chair in the intensive care recovery wing of the Missoula General Hospital. Her hands were heavily bandaged, treating the second-degree frostbite that had miraculously spared her fingers from amputation. Across the room, Margaret sat propped up in a hospital bed, eating a cup of warm applesauce. The pneumonia had nearly taken her, but modern antibiotics and the sheer stubborn will of her daughter had pulled her back from the brink. The heavy door to the hospital room opened, and Deputy Miller walked in. He looked older, tired, and carried his uniform hat in his hands. He couldn't meet Abigail's eyes at first. "Mrs. Preston," Miller said, his voice quiet. "I wanted to come by personally." "Deputy," Abigail replied, her tone neutral, guarded. "I've submitted my resignation to the sheriff," Miller confessed, looking down at his boots. "I shouldn't have executed that eviction order. The weather was a death sentence. I let the badge and Mr. Sterling's money blind me to basic human decency. I am so deeply sorry." Abigail studied the young man. She had spent the last 2 weeks harboring a deep, simmering rage toward him, but looking at his broken demeanor, she realized the mountain had exacted its toll on him too. "You followed a legal order, Deputy. The man who gave it to you is the one who bears the sin." Miller nodded gratefully, pulling a manila folder from his jacket. "Speaking of Richard Sterling, he's out of surgery. The vascular damage from the engine shrapnel and the frostbite was too extensive. They had to amputate his right leg above the knee." Abigail felt no joy at the news, only a cold, hard sense of justice. "The state attorney is charging him with 2 counts of attempted murder, reckless endangerment, and massive financial fraud," Miller continued, opening the folder. "The forensic teams got out to the cave before the spring thaw collapsed it. They recovered Arthur Sterling's remains, his journal, and the lockbox." Miller pulled out a pristine, heavy plastic sleeve containing a yellowed piece of paper. "The 1,922 mineral rights deed. The county clerk authenticated it yesterday," Miller said, handing it to Abigail. "Richard's surface deed is effectively worthless without this. The mining conglomerate in Seattle pulled their offer the moment the arrest hit the papers. The rights to the silver underneath that valley, Mrs. Preston, they belong to your husband's estate. They belong to you." Abigail took the heavy plastic sleeve with her bandaged hands. She looked at the ornate, typewritten legal jargon that had cost Arthur his life and had nearly cost her and her mother theirs. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was security. It was the absolute guarantee that Margaret would spend the rest of her days in warmth, comfort, and the best specialized care money could buy. It was Thomas's final, unintended gift. "Thank you, Miller," Abigail said softly, placing the deed on the bedside table next to Margaret's applesauce. "Abby?" Margaret called out, her voice still weak, but clear of the dementia haze that the severe cold had exacerbated. She looked toward the window, where the afternoon sun was catching the snow-capped peaks of the distant mountains. "It's warm in here." Abigail stood up, walking over to the bed, and gently resting her bandaged hand over her mother's frail arm. "It is, Mom. It's going to be warm from now on." The Bitterroot Mountains hold many secrets, but the legend of Abigail Preston remains etched into their granite peaks. She did not just survive a deadly eviction at 35 degrees below zero. She shattered a decades-old cycle of familial greed. Margaret lived 2 more years, peaceful, warm, and secure in a specialized care facility funded by the very earth Richard had tried to steal. Richard, confined to a high-security prison infirmary, was left with nothing but the phantom pains of an amputated leg and the cold realization of his own hubris. The cave collapsed entirely the following spring, sealing Arthur Sterling's grave and the mountain's violent history forever. Today, the Preston name represents not victimhood, but an unbreakable will. When the winter winds howl through the Montana valleys, they no longer sing a song of death, but whisper a testament to a widow who fought the ice and won.